Hi, I'm Bob Curtis, the co-producer of Minding the Gap. Thank you for joining us today, and welcome to our first episode. I just have one little note before we start. We had a few sound issues during this episode, but we have made note of them and solved the issues moving forward. Even so, we have decided to air this episode in spite of the audio issues. Thank you for bearing with us, and we hope you enjoy the show. Hi, I'm Robert Curtis. I am the co-producer and co-host of Minding the Gap, and this is my son, Dylan Curtis, who is a co-producer and co-host. And we are calling it Minding the Gap because we hope to give exposure to stories that don't normally get a lot of light, or at least give a new angle to them. And this is our first episode, and I would like to start off by, the title of our episode is The UN, Past, Present, and Future, and the UN meaning United Nations. I'd like to start off by introducing our two guests. We were very happy to have them. Our first guest is Ken McCaleb, who I've known for 6 years or more from my freelance work at the UN. Ken started his career assisting Herb Abramson, co-founder of Atlantic Records, while training as a master audio engineer. He then accepted a position as a staff cameraman soundman for Screen Gems, Columbia Pictures in New York City. After freelancing for a dozen TV shows, Ken began editing TV for Fox News Network. Intrigued with political news segments, he then transferred his ambitions to the United Nations as a senior TV director, where I worked under Ken as a cameraman. Since then, he has directed pool network coverage for 5 presidents and 3 popes, and that's quite a long stretch, and he's worked with a lot of notable personalities along the way. Ken is currently the executive producer and moderator for U.S. World Report. His philosophy for the show, news talk without the unnecessary spin, which we appreciate. The links to U.S. World Report and other references will be posted at the end of this show. Welcome, Ken, and thank you. We are very pleased and honored to have you here with us today.
Oh, thank you, Bob.
And it's great to see you and your son coming together on this fine show.
Our next guest is Tom Osborne, who is a longtime friend and colleague of Ken's. Tom was assigned by ABC's Peter Jennings as reporter, producer, and bureau chief to the United Nations during the Gulf War. He covered primetime news stories for World News Tonight, Good Morning America, and 2020. While heading up the ABC News UN office, Tom's reporting included the breakup of the Soviet Union, the breakup of Yugoslavia, and the various wars that ensued in places like Bosnia, where genocidal crimes not seen since World War II were committed. Tom also covered 3 other genocides that occurred in the 90s, in Iraq against the Kurds, in Rwanda, and in Darfur. Tom is currently founder and senior journalist of U.S. World Report, where he works on a daily basis with our first guest, Ken McCaleb. Tom's book, Genocide for Beginners, covers his ABC UN reporting and is available from Amazon.com. Thank you, Tom. This is our first time meeting, and we are equally honored to have you here with us today. Welcome, Tom.
Thank you, Bob. Good to be here.
Yeah.
Thanks, Tom.
So we titled this the United Nations Past, Present, and Future. So let's kind of start off a little bit. I don't know how much history you all know, but I'm assuming you know more than I do. When I was reading, I noticed that this idea actually started out as was kind of a spin-off, or after the League of Nations was dropped after World War I. What do you know about that, how that came about? I think Franklin Roosevelt was somebody who pushed this in the beginning.
Actually, Eleanor Roosevelt was the pusher. she nodded and got her husband involved. So, that was it was a rough beginning. But Tom, you want to elaborate?
Well, it was a rough beginning out at Lake Success, not at the present location where it was. And there was a lot of people who didn't want to see it. It was an international organization, very much like we have today, withdrew a lot of criticism, too much entanglement overseas, and so on. But it trudged along, and over months and year, it finally came to fruition, and the General Assembly came into being. And it was an exciting time, and I think momentous, of course. And unfortunately, I think most of us have lost sight of what the United Nations was intended to be and where it was trying to go. And today it is really lost in the woods, and we can talk more about that.
So just to ask, what was the original intention behind the United Nations?
From what little I know, it was a result of the World War II. They were saying never again, and that was always the slogan, never again. But that's not quite what happened, is it?
Right. Well, how did it, because the League of Nations, which was actually somewhat of a brainchild, and the person got behind it was Woodrow Wilson, who we're hearing a lot about these days. But that died. And then I'm just curious about, I guess they thought, well, the idea is good, but I was wondering if you possibly knew what is it about the League of Nations that didn't work, and how they expected maybe the second attempt at such an an organization.
I can speak to that, Robert.
Yeah.
I think actually the League of Nations was quite successful, and worldwide it was approved, and it was a great achievement, almost, well, as great as the United Nations it was. And it would have been, but unfortunately Wilson was the problem. And he was despised at home at that point. He was basically a race baiter. He really was not the noble person that we all think of him. He certainly was great, and he was brilliant. But the tragedy was Wilson himself. He would not accept any compromise on the League of Nations within the Congress. And it was the U.S. Congress that rejected it outright. And it was basically due to Woodrow Wilson. And that really complicated the new beginnings, but it also made clear what we don't want. And much of that found its way into the UN Charter. And as Ken has already pointed out, principal mover and shaker on making that a humanitarian organization, which had obligations to human rights, was Eleanor Roosevelt, who actually was the author of the Declaration of Human Rights.
Right.
And we also had the Lemkin was a name that we should know, and Lemkin was really an architect of what we know now today as the way we answer human rights, and to the degree that it is a form of genocide, Lemkin addressed that. And that was very much a part of the United Nations Never Again. And so it was a few people who really drove what the United Nations was and what direction it took. And eventually, of course, we now know it today as the most powerful body in the world, and that is the UN Security Council, which is paramount, way ahead of the General Assembly. The General Assembly, now, I'll be very brief here, and the General Assembly is very much attending to the nations and the people at home, the citizens of the world, whereas the UN Security Council is very selective, and it never is out of session. It's always in session, and it is committed to meeting and assisting in the creation of peace and security throughout the world. So its primary responsibility is international peace and security. And that's where we really find most of the action. At least that's where I found the action in covering the United Nations.
So my question then is, if we know the original purposes behind it, is where did it all start to kind of go awry, or just start to sort of deviate from its original course?
I have a theory.
Go ahead, Ken, please.
There was a senator from the South who questioned why we were teaching it in our schools. I know when I was a youth, we were still being taught about the UN as a sanctuary for people to turn to. And then suddenly it was dropped from the curriculum. And I don't know exactly who the senator is. Maybe you do, Tom, but he started bad-mouthed it, and all of a sudden it was no longer part of our education.
Well, that's true. Don't offhand know the Senate. I know what you're speaking of course. But I think one of the primary problems, and it's one we're facing today with the United Nations, and that is our commitment to evangelical nationalism, or nationalism, if you will. But in our country right now, we all know the reality is it does have a hook, and it's religion.
Right.
And it's both religious and political. And we always say that it's not polite to have religion and politics at the table. We have it on at a banquet right now in the United States. And it's one of the most serious threats we have. And that is putting, in my opinion, that is, putting God and country on the same line. When did that happen?
Right.
That's one of the problems. We've lost sight of our role as the exceptional nation in the world. And we see ourselves as somehow less than the international voice when we hear it. That's really what we created, the international voice that exists. Now, just one quick example, and I'll move on. Voice of America has completely lost its way.
Right.
And now, in fact, it's being staffed by a political appointee whose only interest is perpetuating the so-called reputation of the United States that is being held by this administration.
Right.
Certainly not the rest of the American people.
Right.
So those are some of the problems.
Well, and I can't remember the name who runs that now, but he had kind of a burning. He just fired everybody and put in like political appointments.
Well, the problem is that we have selected, as we have in the past on 2 or 3 occasions, a Secretary General who is a great man, a good man, a very constructive person, someone we need at the time, but he is not going to buck anything that the Americans say. And if he has, he's completely ignored. And it means nothing, really, but he's completely neutralized.
Right.
We haven't had an activist Secretary General since Boutros Ghali, and he was given an actual role in calling on American troops. And that really set us back a lot.
Right.
People really didn't like that. It was during the Bosnian conflict and so on.
Well,
he was only Secretary General for one term because he had spoken up against the United States. So that's always been a danger. If you're a Secretary General and you don't support the U.S., which actually carries most of the budget, and that's the other comment. When we talk about the UN, why it's no longer considered valid, the bulk of the financing came from the U.S., and now that seems to be changing, and it may actually become China.
Right.
Yes. Also, you remember the great statement by Boutros Ghali when he was asked, "I'm in charge," he said at the time, and that was the end of Boutros Ghali.
Well, and George, the first George Bush was the president at that time.
Yes, that's another. I was going to mention George W. Bush.
George W.
George Herbert Walker Bush was president when I came in.
Right.
And that was the time in which the entire world was really kind of falling apart. It was the first of the 90s. We had the breakup of the Soviet Union. An entire, vast, huge nation to break up. Then you had, before that, the break of Yugoslavia, the former Yugoslavia, which led to all the Bosnian conflicts and all of those small and large wars. So it was kind of a breakup of the whole world, and we're still suffering. Well, not suffering, but we're still dealing with that. We haven't yet come to grips with it.
Right. Yeah.
So that's pretty interesting that was such a pivotal time for the UN, and because I'm coming at this from, I guess, more of a unknowing stances. What roles did the UN have to play in that whole scenario after, in terms of attempting to keep peace and the actual breakup of the nation into separate nations and nation states? Did they rise to the task, or was it ultimately considered more of a failure?
No, they did not rise to the task, and that was really the great embarrassment of the UN, and really the tragedy at the moment of the UN being manipulated by the 5 great powers. During the Bosnian conflict, the breakup of the Soviet Union, the breakup of Yugoslavia, there was a specific drive by Westerners behind the scenes in the UN Security Council, which no one could see or hear, I happened to be very close to the president of the council at the time, Diego Aria from Venezuela, before it became revolutionary bureau. Also, we had close connections with the United States, and I should say some of the people who were afraid that if Bosnia were to be a successful nation, as it was declared, you would have in the West, or in Europe, a Muslim nation in the heart of Europe. And that was deeply concerning to the Western powers, Britain, France, particularly. The U.S., of course, they were afraid of going too far on this, but they did go along with it. And what you had, long story short, the United Nations designated a UN safe haven, you may recall, in Bosnia to protect the women and children and the men. And at that time, Milosevic and Mladic were killing with their irregular troops these citizens. Remember, ethnic cleansing was introduced for the first time since World War II in the heart of Europe. And of course, when they went to allow the safe haven, the citizens, the innocents, were herded in, men and boys, into that safe haven, and they were all shot and buried in a mass grave with 1,000. And that was under the watchful eye of Dutch peacekeepers 400 yards away. They were never given an order to intercede. They asked for orders, they never got it. They never got it from the US, they never got it from France, they never got it from the Security Council at all. And that's what took place. Now, you can answer the question as to who's responsible for that. But that's where the United Nations lost all of its credibility.
Right.
Not only in the press, me included, but everyone.
Well, coincidentally, I wanted to add, Tom and the co-host of our radio show, Dr. David Canervo, have written a book called
Genocide for Beginners.
Yes.
And obviously the book is meant for people like me who had never seen a genocide before, except I do recount in the book, just briefly, my experience growing up as a 15-year-old south of Cleveland, 20 miles. Most genocides occur 20 miles away from civilization.
Right.
They're not somewhere hundreds of miles where we can't get to it. It's usually 20 or 30 miles away. And 20 miles away from me was Huff, Cleveland. I was working there in York Church youth camps, and we went to the inner city. And then they came on with urban renewal, and they bulldozed all of those neighborhoods, African-American neighborhoods in Cleveland, and built high-rises that nobody could live in.
Right.
And that in itself is a form of genocide. There's no account taken of who they put in the homeless category.
Right.
So this is what happens in genocide. It's a very small thing, but it becomes huge, and nobody knows about it until it's over. We went through that with Darfur, Rwanda,
Right.
the northern Iraq, and the Syrians, and the Kurds, all during the 90s. Mm-hmm. And that's amazing. That's just shocking. What happened?
Yeah. Well, it's unreasonable. And it's one of those things where you really wish that the UN was more aggressive or more outspoken about it, because it seems like that would really be their place to do so, but there's a breakdown there somewhere.
Yeah, once and again, the breakdown is the United States of America.
Okay.
The United States can lead that organization and must.
Right.
Because we only have the wealth to do it. We can make mistakes. Most countries can't. We can include Britain and France, but they're smaller players compared to the United States. There's just no doubt about it. Mm-hmm. Well, the United States doesn't want to go to Darfur or doesn't want to go to Iraq and Northern Iraq, Syria. They don't. That's the end of it.
Right. So if they could have had a direct, this encompasses a lot, actually. And I wanted to talk about this too, and we're in this, and I'm glad we are. Often in an organization or even a person, somebody or an organization's strength is also, if you flip the coin, can be their great weakness. You have a body like the United Nations that is made up of hundreds of Nations. You have the Security Council, which is 5 permanent members, and then 10 elected members. But everybody has input, and there's no way you're going to make everybody happy. So is that part of the paralysis, just the way it's set up? Or you're saying if there's a strong leader in the Secretary General or by the United States, it should be able to push through that?
Or do you want to?
Well, let me take a stab at it first.
I'll take the second shot.
Yeah. The 5 primaries were right after World War II. They were the most powerful at the time, so they figured, okay, give them permanent seats. Now that seems completely out of touch today.
Right.
So there's talk about expanding it, and maybe one day they'll get to it, but right now it doesn't look that way.
And the 5 members,
misunderstanding, and that is that the Secretary General has some sort of power, like he has a military force. He doesn't. The peacekeepers come voluntarily from member states, meaning countries that say, okay, I'm going to send you 100 troops and you can do whatever you want with them, but they'll be under the guidance of so-and-so as the commander. And it's not usually the UN. So there's a real disconnect when it comes to moving the troops around, especially the peacekeepers.
Right.
And they've been getting a bad rap.
Also, I would just mention too that with the 5 permanent members, you have the veto, and the veto has been the basic problem. Dylan actually asked who's responsible for this. It would be the veto, the Russian veto, for example, during the period in which shortly after the Soviet Union collapse. The veto was hardly ever used, and in fact, that's one of the reasons that Putin says he's taking such aggression, is to make up for all of the destruction and dismantling that happened because the veto was not used by Russia anymore for years. I don't know 10 vetoes from Russia, not that many.
I think there's only been 1 or 2 in the years that I was there, so it didn't happen very often.
Right, and now, of course, it happens every day. I mean, we don't even watch it anymore. I try to keep up once in a while, but it's almost impossible. I think can just escalators.
Tom is referring to, and Robert, you probably know about this because you've been currently freelancing there, but. They're financially constrained right now. When the U.S. hasn't contributed, it appears that whenever there's a Republican in the White House, the budget doesn't get paid from the U.S. contributions.
Right.
So the latest word out is that the escalators had to be turned off to save money from the electrical bills.
And that's a 38-story building. 30, 40. Yeah.
Yeah, there's been a lot of changes there to just the operation, and I think and I know Reagan did something similar at one point, but he used it as pressure for some sort of idea about corruption or mismanagement of some kind.
Well, he was. That's always been the U.S. position, is the bureaucracy is bloated. It's got too much, in the Secretariat building on First Avenue there. Too much at the U.S. mission. All these things are just basic businesses. That's baloney.
Right.
They just don't want to make the commitment to internationalism.
Right.
Which is a touchy word. What does that mean? I don't know. I don't really know what that means, and I do know what nationalism means, and I don't like it.
Right.
I don't like the looks of it.
Right.
So I think those are the 2 things that are pitting against each other.
So do you see, if 4 members, and let's say the 5 members are France, the UK, Russia, the United States, and China. So if any one of those vetoes, a Security Council resolution does not go through, does that make a difference as far as what the UN is allowed to do?
Yes.
Absolutely.
It tells the UN we can't do anything.
So their hands are tied.
Absolutely tied. There's no money. There's no troops. So there's no peace. There's no nothing. It's not going to happen.
So Russia, you're saying now Russia does this all the time. So
yeah, all the time. It's a permanent deadlock. If Russia doesn't do it, China does it. If the U.S. does it, I mean, if China does it, the U.S. does it. The three of them playing around all the time in the geopolitical scene.
Right.
Yeah. So I mean, what it sounds like there's, we can point the finger at ourselves pretty well in terms of deadlocking situations and playing up nationalism and whatnot. But it also seems like these other countries are doing the exact same thing at the exact same time, and it's difficult to get around that. So
one feeds the other. I mean, if the U.S. is being nationalistic, Russia is going to be nationalistic. France is going to be. Britain is going to be. China is going to be. So that's what you have. Thank the United States.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So we have gone down a rabbit hole, and ever since I would say, shortly after 2000, we've lost it on the international scene. What we did in Iraq, that invasion was such a lie.
Right.
And everyone, that was another thing that lost all credibility into that. Because you had Colin Powell sitting at the United Nations Security Council holding up a file saying that we know that they're transporting WMD in whatever they were doing. I don't know what he said, something ridiculous.
And yellow cake uranium?
Yeah, yellow cake. I knew Colin Powell. I mean, I talked to him. He's a reasonable man, an honest man. And he was really taken. I feel very sad what happened to him then.
Yeah. Because
that was not true. I did a film documentary. I was there in Iraq. I interviewed Tariq Aziz for 2 hours. I went to every inspector. We went all over Iraq. And every single person in the United States that had really any capacity or for internationalism or respect for human rights was absolutely opposed to this invasion. And we see what happened. And it completely destroyed the UN, our credibility completely when we did that.
Now, I'd like to offer some optimism about the UN, and that is there is a group called Model UN, which introduces the concept and what it stands for, the charter, to young students from around the world. Now, if anybody's going to fix this thing, it's going to be the next generation, because they're very optimistic and very involved. And I mean, you can see it in just locally with what's going on in politics. So I don't believe that the UN is dead in the water. I just think it's kind of in a sleep mode.
Yeah.
I don't think it's dead in the water either, Ken. I know I sound like it, but I'm just sort of laying the land for what is good about it. And what you said is true. The Model UN is all over the United States. Almost every kid in the United States has been through that. And they know what the United Nations is supposed to do. But they know how it's supposed to work. So when they measure it against what they see, there's a lot of questions. And good, there should be a lot of questions. And I think what we're going to see, and I don't know for sure, of course, nobody knows what's going to happen in November. But if this administration changes, I think we will see a renewed commitment to the United Nations. There are so many people that are working in the United Nations right now that we don't hear about. Because they're just off the page.
Right.
But they're doing all kinds of fantastically wonderful and necessary things. And we'll hear about them later on when we can.
Well, one of the other good extensions of the UN, of course, is UNICEF. And,
yes.
I have a friend from Australia who is, he's heading up the sort of a new marketing campaign to refresh and bring it to young people as well. And it's so I think what you're going to see is in the next couple of years is a very positive change.
Yeah. I mean, one reason, the main reason I wanted to bring this show to the air was because I do definitely believe in the UN. And I also know that you can't fix problems unless you identify them. And I think we need to be real. It is definitely a political body, but I did want to stick to the Security Council just for a second and ask you. I mean, some person would say, okay, so now you have the 5 permanent members, and one veto can just derail everything. So why don't we just make it a democratic body. But then you're like, okay, so we say to China or Russia, your veto, we're not going to give anybody veto power. And then that's like, they're out of there. Is that pretty much, it's like we try to keep people together, but as soon as you upset somebody, they're gone. I mean, it's just a hard place to be.
They're stuck in the same world.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, as far as keeping them,
they can push their chair back from the table.
yes,
but they're still in the United States and the United Nations,
right.
and they're going to be there. But I think, the five know that this is the way to go. They know that they can't have a democratic process.
Right.
I mean, that would be, everybody. What would happen in Srebrenica? They'd vote to, who knows?
Right.
If I could compare what we're discussing here, it's kind of like the U.S. government doesn't want to get rid of the Electoral College.
Yes.
And the UN doesn't want to get rid of the veto or the five powers.
Right.
And they don't want to extend it to, 15 countries to rotate the vote. I mean, that would be the ideal, but that's,
right. But that could be very,
process to get there.
that would be very scary to do as well, just as scary.
That happens, though, without the veto, you do have 15 members all voting the same way for a measure. And so it is somewhat democratic. The only problem is you have a veto. And I don't know if that's a problem, but I guess it is.
Right.
I don't really know if it's a problem.
Right.
I know it's been a problem.
Right.
So I guess the one scenario I'd ask this to each one of you is if you had the magic wand power, full Harry Potter, what would you do to fix the UN? No questions asked, whatever you say gets done. What would you do to improve it? I'd ask that question of you individually.
Well, first thing I would do is get rid of the veto and turn it into a 15-vote democratic. So whatever the majority rules, then at least you have an idea that the world body is somewhat united.
Yes.
Tom?
Well, I think that's the right step.
Do you see that?
Restore credibility to the United Nations. In other words, when you say you're committed to doing something, you finish it, you do it. And if the rest of the world sitting around the table at the Security Council had felt that the 15 vote was just, well, then it would be a moot point. It would be taken care of. Mm-hmm. But if they didn't, then the world would have a good sense of where everybody's at, and maybe they'll take a step back from doing something.
It seems to work for the Supreme Court. So the majority rules, and
right.
so I see this as a no-brainer.
Yeah, I do too.
Do you see that as a possibility? Do you think that is something that they will consider?
If you could get the United, no. If you could get if you get the United States, Russia, and France, China to agree, yeah. But it would take.
Yeah, they don't want to let go of their veto.
Well, not in this world. I mean, look at what we're doing with the virus. Where is the United Nations with the virus? I mean,
right.
Certainly the United Nations was meant to deal with something like this.
Right.
Doesn't it have all the tools? Yes.
Right.
Well, I'd like to jump in there because
we're talking about
I was very involved in the Ebola recovery and got to witness it firsthand and watched the World Health Organization very readily take it on and do a good job. We had a Dr. David Navarro who would report to us regularly as to the progress, and he would come back exhausted, but he just kept going back and fighting it. And then at that time, Barack Obama was very involved, and in fact, he hosted several meetings within the UN corridors dealing with Ebola, and eventually we got control of it. And it didn't take that long. This particular virus, without the WHO involvement, it's not going to go away. And so I'm a little concerned about how long this virus will be with us.
Well, I also think, Ken, that it's possible that if there's a new administration, that the United Nations would be given the task of dealing with the virus. And
through the WHO. Through the WHO.
Yes, exactly. Everything has problems. The WHO has a lot of problems. They make mistakes. For God's sake, we have made some mistakes here.
Right.
We are now the most dangerous country in the world when it comes to this virus. So nobody wants us to come and visit.
Right.
There's something wrong with this picture.
Right.
Well, I don't know. I have sort of like a thought on that because everything about what we hear in the news in response to the CDC, WHO, is it always is one is trying to pit the other one against them, and they're putting out conflicting information. And then you have a lot of talk how WHO covered a lot of information for China during the initial outbreak. And when you're wondering, who can be trusted, and not saying WHO can be trusted, who can be trusted, do you think this would be the time where the United Nations could really shine and bridge the gaps, or do something completely independent, or have an independent aggregate of information, and that could be something that would restore credibility to the UN?
Well, I can tell you one issue, but give an example here of where the United States and the rest of the world is. On the issue of Cuba, which is a big part of our national election. I mean, at least in Miami, it's a huge conservative, strongly supported of overthrowing Castro regimes. But Cuba is a vote that they take in the General Assembly every year, and the United States for decades has only gotten 2 or 3 votes in favor of their position on Cuba. The entire General Assembly votes against them every time. And the whole world sees that. So in that sense, the United Nations is very effective. Mm-hmm. And it is effective in terms of when the Security Council is without the veto. So it can work. And that's one way it's working, by popular dispute, you might say. At least it gives the rest of the world a chance to say what they think about it.
I guess one of the criticisms I hear, the one I've been hearing a lot about the WHO recently, is that they seem to be very sluggish, or they're a little behind the wave in some respects, and also I also know, but it's not an easy job because they don't want to burn bridges to countries that they need to have relationships with. So it's not always a comfortable place for them to be, but I think hopefully I don't think the WHO doesn't seem to have the high score that it did when it was with Ebola. So hopefully they can come out of this.
Robert, it's a different administration.
Oh yeah, completely.
And it really seemed to jump on it very quickly, and we built hospitals, and we had people. We had people on the ground, and we had people working from boats, and I mean it was just a huge undertaking, and they had the financing, because once again we had Obama at the time who was paying the UN bills, so there was an ability to respond, and now they don't have that money. And like I said, the escalators were turned off, so you can imagine how that might affect just budgeting for the COVID virus.
Right.
So if you compare what they've done to WHO to what they're now doing to Fauci, who is an international voice on the pandemic. Fauci is probably one of the most credible people on the scene, and certainly in terms of his history and his devotion to several different presidents have all accepted his advice. Now suddenly he's a liar. He's made mistakes.
Right.
He's become politicized, and
completely.
So has the whole thing, the pandemic. Everything you mentioned about it has been politicized.
Right.
And so there is no way that this president can call upon anybody, because it's all a political game.
Yeah, it's.
I mean, I'm sorry to be critical of the administration, but
I'm
been very balanced over the decade. I've worked with every kind of president we've had, And for me, it didn't make any difference. What I was doing was cover the United Nations. But I cover the United Nations now, and I can tell you, this is a very destructive, dangerous administration. I'm just saying it from my point of view.
You can see it at the General Assemblies. I've been there about 6 years, and just the attendance during the General Assembly has been. It's just not the the spirit of cooperation. It was always a clearinghouse. There were so many people. You saw groups of people everywhere. Everybody was talking to each other. But after the first or second year of Trump, things just really got quiet. And it was a real shame. I mean, and I could not help but think it had a lot to do with, he is not a president that, for the spirit of cooperation.
Nations at its height. And so it's it's amazing how far we've fallen. Once the air has gone out, what's out, the United States.
Right. Well, that's what I was saying. That's the reason why I wanted to have you all in here. It's very easy to destroy something.
It's so easy, and that's so fragile.
Yes.
Think about writing that Human Rights Declaration and how you had to have so many people to agree on that, and then have it destroyed and just trampled on, in these last two decades.
Well, a lot of it has to do with how the dialogue is being directed, because you've got these accusations and people on the attack and slamming personalities and this and that. We didn't have that years ago. In fact, Tom, you were very active in the Kennedy administrations, and the dialogue has just changed. It's not something. It's embarrassing to listen to the nightly news.
If you remember, President Kennedy called it the last best hope. That's what he called it. And what do we call it today?
Well, can I read you something? I picked this up off the internet. So
everything's true on the internet.
Well, no, I mean this sounds very credible because this is a news report. Kofi Annan defended his Deputy Secretary General, Mark Malloch Brown, who openly criticized the United States in a speech on June 6, 2006. And he said, quote, "The prevailing practice of seeking to use the UN almost by stealth as a diplomatic tool while failing to stand up for it against its domestic critics is simply not sustainable. You will lose the UN one way or the other. And that the U.S. is constructively engaged with the UN is not well known or understood in part because much of the public discourse that reaches the U.S. heartland has been largely abandoned to its loudest detractors, such as you know, Rush Limbaugh, Fox News, and some of them. And he got a lot of criticism for that, but a lot of observers, John Bolton was hugely critical of that statement, but a lot of observers from other nations supported Malloch's view that conservative politicians in the U.S. prevented many citizens from understanding the benefits of U.S. involvement in the UN.
That goes back to what I was saying when it was removed from the curriculum of schools. And I remember that speech. I was fairly new as a director when Mark Malloch Brown made that comment. And I also happened to, you mentioned in the opening that I worked at Fox. I actually did work with Rush Limbaugh for a while.
Right.
And it was very disturbing hearing the two speeches, simultaneously. In fact, when I interviewed at the UN, the first thing they asked me was, "So you worked at Fox?" And they were a little leery about that,
Right, right.
And I said, they go, "Well, what do you think of, some of the comments that are coming out of there?" And I said, "Well, that's the reason I left. I didn't agree with that." And
Right.
I only spent 20 weeks at Fox, but, and then they asked me about, the comments from John Bolton, and I at that time I hadn't met John yet, but I was a little. I think I said the right thing. I said, at that time he said the first the top 10 floors or 7 floors you can knock it off and nobody would notice. But
right.
I said no, I don't agree with that either. So I think I answered, and truthfully, this was my opinion at the time. And I was offered the job right then and there. But they were looking to help change that,
Right.
the dialogue, and also to bring back education to young people. And I think that's what's happening now. It's we're doing, like, this podcast is helping.
Right.
Shows like Bill Miller's Global Connections television, shows like our radio show, U.S. World Report. We bring up these topics and we try to hope and inject some future for the organization.
Well, I think another problem you have, and of course, the insufficient consistency of the United States. It's constant fluctuation. You lose great people like Mark Malloch Brown. You lose people like that who give their lives to the U.S.
Right.
Who are ready to sacrifice. And they're still working in the background, but their voice has been sidelined. And of course, Kofi Annan is one of the greatest secretaries general that we've had. He was brilliant, and unfortunately, his son got into some problems, but he was not a part of that. But of course, he was bitten by that. And,
Right.
And both of them, Mark Malloch Brown and Kofi Annan, that was one of the greatest moments of the United Nations.
Here's another interesting thing, and that was Ban Ki-moon. He tried during his 10 years, he had 2 terms,
Right.
To inject some excitement about the UN. He got a lot of celebrities involved, like George Clooney. It just went on and on, the list of people he brought in to excite young people specifically, so that they would volunteer and get more involved. We had Angelina Jolie.
Right. She was on a commission. Yeah.
It's just the list is ridiculous, and it was a lot of fun, working with these people, because they were really trying. They're trying to inject a hope and optimism.
Right. Well, it seems like there's always been more than two-prong, but a 2 main prong workings of the UN. The important ones. One is the social, economic, cultural, and to work on poverty and human rights, and the other one is the peacekeeping force. And I just routinely hear people put down the peacekeeping, because I sometimes think they don't quite have a great understanding of what its role really is. It's not to win a war, it's to hopefully intercede and to help with peace agreements and keep people alive. And even in Rwanda, they did that to a degree, even though they failed in other ways. And like you said, in Bosnia, but in other places they did not. But then in the human rights and the social, I keep telling. I used to get in arguments with people. My son is going to laugh at me now. On Facebook, get in debates. So many people, and it's also a question of a problem with cynicism, I think, because people become so cynical so quickly. And I think I want to do a whole show on cynicism, to be honest with you. Oh, yeah, because I'm telling you, I understand disappointment, but cynicism is not a place you want to go as a personal space in yourself. But I want to say, you don't know what the organization does for children and women and the dispossessed. And I see the people there, and they are dedicated, like you said, and they work hard, and they're working against governments that do not like them or want them, and it's always an uphill battle. But they don't see that, and so they just say, "Oh, the peacekeeping force, they're crap. Lose them. Just lose the whole UN." And again, it goes back to this education thing.
Yeah, and I want to bring up Michelle Bachelet, who was the head of UN Women and is now the Human Rights Commissioner. She has worked tirelessly for the last decade. In fact, she took a break from being the president of Chile to come work with us for 5 years, and she was sought so much by her country to return and be president a second term.
Right.
She left. At one time, she was actually being considered as the next Secretary General. But I asked her, I said, there's a rumor out there. You're either going to be the next SG or you're going to return to your country and become president. She goes, I think the latter is more accurate. So she was trying to deal with things at home.
Right.
And but now she's over in Geneva and she's stirring things up.
But one of the other problems I think is that the United States cannot be elected president of the Security Council.
Right.
And I think that would be helpful if they could. I might be wrong. Not now.
Right.
Sometime. The other thing I want to correct, though, I think I left the wrong impression. The Dutch peacekeepers were in no way responsible for not doing something. They asked for permission to intervene and could not get it.
This is Rwanda?
No, the Dutch peacekeepers were in Bosnia. Srebrenica.
Right.
That's where they killed 1,000.
And they could not get orders. Yeah.
On the subject of the things my father just brought up in terms of the amazing things that the UN does still do and the real passion there for humanitarian efforts, is this something that you feel, if you separated out the bureaucracy of the humanitarian side and peacekeeping side, which I mean does seem intertwined, but unfortunately one seems to function much better than the other. If we were to divide that up, do you think that would help, either in lightening up some of the bureaucracy or making funding more difficult to withhold from one side versus the other? You think breaking up the United Nations responsibilities into different organizations would be effective?
One of the overlying efforts, big moves by the United States, the UN Security Council, was to bring into force what they call the right to protect, called RTP. And it's, in fact, got by use of force. And of course, you mentioned peacekeeping and why it doesn't work. But basically, it isn't backed up with the use of force. As you say, they're neutralizing some situation, but they need use of force, and they don't have that. Now, the RTP does provide that. Mm-hmm. So it's a move in that direction.
I know what I wanted to add to that, Tom and Robert and Dylan, is that if there was, say, an international draft for peacekeepers, and it was to go under, let's say you have the 15 Democratic Security Council, and it rotates, and the president of that month suggests a general that will lead the peacekeepers during that period of time. Mm-hmm. Then you might get something, because young people are willing. They would love to come in and generate peace around the world. Yeah. So it might take something like that, and it's going to take someone very progressive to initiate a program like that.
Yeah, I think you're right, Ken. It's absolutely. If the United States would allow U.S. citizens to volunteer for peacekeeping, can you imagine there would be so many young people that would jump into that? They already do with the Peace Corps.
With like Greenpeace, the Peace Corps. There's so many organizations that already are out there. I think that would. I think absolutely right. You would generate huge interest.
Absolutely, and we'd be a part of it. We'd have some skin in the game. So, we do back things up with our troops, but that's after they go awry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's one part.
Then it's a fight. It's a war.
Yeah. The idea is hopefully to get there before we get to that level.
Exactly. Now, the Dutch could have intervened in that 400 peacekeepers were there in Srebrenica with those 1,000 people going to take papers. They could have intervened in that, but we did not politically want to save them. We had other priorities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's why I just kind of think that unencumbering the bureaucracy of it would go a long way.
Right. That's why I mentioned RTP, because it's the humanitarian with use of force.
Yes.
There are a lot of specialized agencies through the UN, which is the WHO, the World Health Organization, is one of them. World Intellectual Property Organization, the Food and Agricultural Organization, International Atomic Energy Agency. There's like They're everywhere. UNESCO, United Nations, educational, scientific.
If you think about the post-Gulf War era in which we had to deal with weapons of mass destruction, the United States set up UNSCOM, United Nations Special Commission to destroy the weapons in Iraq.
Right.
They assembled scientists and researchers and inspectors, an inspection team not known to the world before, with every amount of brilliance you can imagine in nuclear and chemical and every aspect of weapons. They did that. The United Nations does that in 5 minutes.
Right.
It happened.
Well, it's like so many things in the news. There's always more drama when things go bad, and like what we're going through with the Black Lives Matter movement. I've been on the phone with people, and they're talking. So many people are just focused. They just hyper focused on the protesting and some of the violence. And I said, listen, where are you getting your news? I get it from YouTube. I said, well, you're going to find 5 seconds of most of these people are protesting peacefully. And yes, there's looters and there's some destruction, absolutely. But you got to look at the causes. And if you go on YouTube, you're going to see 5 seconds of people marching peacefully, and you're going to see 5 hours of looting. That's just the nature. I mean, I'm a cameraman. I'm not going to be, I get 5 seconds of B-roll, and then I go where the action is. So, I mean, it's very hard to show the depth of the UN and what they are doing. And like I said, the work they do for children and women is great, but it's hard to get that out there. So it becomes very polarizing and black and white, and like, okay, it's good, it's bad.
Yeah, well, that's why like a really nice long-form conversation like this is tremendously helpful, because I know I've kind of gone through my life somewhat ignorant of it. I know I learned my knowledge of the UN is still what I learned in elementary school, and then it was here's a box to collect coins for UNICEF, go. So conversations like this are so important, because I mean, we've already been going for almost an hour and a half, and it feels like we just started, and I feel like there's so much more to cover. But I feel like getting that depth is very important.
There's nothing like walking when the UN was working, and when I was there during the 90s and 10s. There's nothing like walking down that long hall toward the delegates' lounge. I used to do that every afternoon around 2 o'clock. I couldn't get the inspiration. It never failed. I ran into exactly the person I needed to see.
Right.
He was either the vice president or the ambassador or the secretary of state or the foreign minister, walking around the UN, just having coffee. And I'd say, oh, there's the guy. I go right up to him and I say, Peter wants to know X, Y, Z. Are you going to do this or not? No, we're not going to do it. Security Council says you are. No, we're not. So you see, that's the way it works. Yeah, it puts everyone in touch. That was the idea of Lake Success back in the late 40s.
Right.
I just want to offer you guys a little history about the building itself. At one time, it was like a city, and it was addressing different cultures and personalities, and you could go. There was a barber shop. There was all kinds of little stores within the UN. There was a tavern. I hate to say this, right outside the Security Council, but
great place for it.
Big decisions require big medication, right?
Yeah, that's
it was rumored
through the night.
of a basketball court up on the 38th or 39th floor, 39th floor, which is the Secretary General.
Right.
So it has a great deal of history. And shoe repair shop. I mean, it's crazy stuff.
Yeah.
That's a good point. If I could just mention just briefly my personal experience with that history. I love my favorite seat was on the balcony, which is no longer there. I guess I don't know what it looks like now, Bob. But on the upper balcony of the delegates' lounge, a huge cavernous place. You could look down and see the delegates, and underneath they were having coffee, and I could easily see from my position, which is always on top of the table in the far left corner, I could see who was coming and going in the delegates' lounge as to whether I could sit there and finish my martini or not. Because who comes and goes determines if Russia's there, I'm fine.
Yeah.
They're not doing anything. U.S. is fine, I'm fine. France, fine. But when they go out of the room, I'm finished. I leave.
Yeah.
But the Delegates Lounge, I once sat up there and I was trying to work on a story about weapons of mass destruction because the Iraqis were simply saying when the U.S. came to a site, they'd say, "There's nothing here. You can't look inside. Nothing here."
Right.
And they needed someone who was an ally of them to make them come clean. So I was sitting up there above in the Delegates Lounge on the balcony, and I hear Lavrov, who was then the ambassador to the United Nations. He's now the foreign minister of Russia. And he was saying to the ambassador of Iraq, he was saying, "Look, you can't stand in front of these places and just say you can't come in."
Yeah.
He speaks perfect English.
Right.
So I immediately ran to the radio, did a top story, Russia pressures Iraq to answer inspectors. So I had a story just sitting up there.
Yeah.
And that's the way it was.
Wow.
Well, and this is a problem for Congress. I've heard this a lot. Personal connections mean a lot. And they don't, I've heard criticism that the left and the right, Democrats and Republicans used to get together and spend more time together in social, and they don't do that as much. And I think that's a problem, because I think once you kind of get to know somebody, it's just, I don't know, there's just a different working, and I think it's important.
I spent a short time in Senator McGovern's office in Washington, and when I was younger, and I had quite an experience in that situation, just as you're talking.
Right.
And, George McGovern, contrary to everything people say, was one of the most respected men in the United States Senate. He certainly was a conservative man. Unfortunately, people don't know that.
Right.
So long story short, I mean, I saw him working with the other side of the aisle, and I saw those people working with him. In those days, it was really just that sort of organization.
Right.
We didn't have it once.
Right. I mean, we could talk forever, but I want to kind of end on a forward note, because past, present, and future, and I've been very heartened what you're saying about the younger generation, because what seems to have really activated them before the whole equal justice and the Black Lives Matter is climate change. They are pushing that, and I think, again, I hope that the UN can really tap into that and help move that along. And I'm sure there's a lot of people working on that now, but I just...
So if there's going to be any development in that area, it'll be after November.
Yes.
Because it's not on the front burner right now, unfortunately, because I wanted to bring it up earlier, but I do think that the kids that are going to inherit this planet, they want to be able to breathe and swim in the ocean and, do all the things that we were able to do without worrying about some calamity. So, it's going to take some time for that to be.
There's a great new climate agreement in the works. The United States has pulled out of all the negotiations.
Right.
So, but they do have people that are participating regardless, so they know what's going on, and we can easily rejoin them. We can also reignite the Iranian nuclear agreement, which was the United Nations.
Well, we can just tag on to the other nations are still in that agreement, correct?
Absolutely, yes. And
yes.
We're the only we created it, and
right.
we left it, which is what we do all the time.
Right.
I don't understand. This is just we shouldn't be able to get away with this, and that's why the United Nations should be an equalizing factor.
Right. Right.
That's the bottom line. We should not be allowed to do this.
Yeah.
In the world that we live in and the world that we depend on.
Well, I think I'm going to end on one thing here, and that is how much, because a lot has kind of slid into the ocean. Some of these organizations, they've been defanged. Now, even the WHO, the defunding, there has been a formal defunding of that, but that doesn't take effect until July. So that can be reversed, I assume, if another administration comes in. So if a new administration does come in, they've got a lot of work to do. Can you speak to that a little bit? I mean, where should they start?
Oh, well, he's going to have his hands full if he's successful. And depending on what his priorities are, I would think priority 1 would be COVID. Priority 2 might be the environment. It's hard to say because, he can't put all his cards on the table right now because he'll be criticized negatively or they'll use it against him or whatever.
Right.
But I believe he's going to have a lot of work ahead if he's successful in his campaign.
Right.
I think that he's serious about international agreements. I think we have to really come down hard on the side of Security Council reform. And that is a huge package with lots of different plans.
Right.
Which can make it very, very democratic, at least in form anyway, and deal with the detail and so on and so forth.
Well, that would be great. I would love to talk about foreign aid because I know there's a lot of opinions on that, especially foreign aid that goes to Africa. But I think maybe we've ended on a good place. Maybe we can have another show about that because that's a huge can of worms, actually. And I have opinions on that for sure. But so let me.
Robert, if I can, I just want to leave you with one optimistic event that's going to take place in October, this coming October. And that is we are doing a fundraiser for Africa to deal with the COVID virus.
Right.
And it's sort of a virtual concert, and a lot of UN people are involved, several ambassadors from Africa. So what they're doing is they're all coming together, music, science, art, and we're putting on a 3-hour show. And it's basically to help address all the clinics and the hospitals and medical supplies in Africa. So there's some very good positive things in development. And I think that one's called Africa Rise.
Africa Rise. And we will see that on Facebook, and I will get links to that and put those up. We're going to get a web page up soon, and I want everybody to know what that is.
By the way, excellent.
What's that?
The background that you have.
Yeah. Well, let me talk briefly though about that's something that you're very involved in, Ken. And I know I wanted to talk a little bit more, Tom, about your book. This. Give us a little bit more. Is that's officially out now, or is it?
It is out. I don't know if you can see it.
Yeah. Genocide for Beginners. It's a great title. I got to tell you, man, it's like Buddhism for dummies.
A weekend.
This is the part where we make all our plugs now.
Yeah,
this is where you plug. I've got a car I'm trying to sell too.
We might be interested in that actually. Yeah.
2001 LeSabre Buick.
Oh, there you go.
I just put a brand new fuel pump in.
Oh, well.
The book recounts my career for 10 years, working with Peter Jennings and dealing with these 3 major genocides, but in particular we focus on the Bosnian genocide.
Right, okay.
And it's for beginners because, as I said, I myself am a beginner. Everyone is a beginner.
Okay.
Nobody can say I know it.
Well, I would love to read this book. And
it's available to Amazon.com. Not a popular figure these days, but there it is.
There it is. Great. And Ken, is there anything else that you want to? You both are, and I just want to say you're both co-founder, and the U.S. World Report is something that I just want to say everybody should listen to. I mean, some of their most recent titles just are hooks. And the last one I really want to listen to was called Violence, Fire in America. And also you have a segment on Voice of America Under Siege. We talked a little bit about that. So, I mean, these are really topical things that you're working on, and I would
recommend a recent program we did interviewing Arthur Schlesinger Jr. This is the third or junior, Ken?
The junior, Arthur Schlesinger. It's Stephen Schlesinger.
I'm sorry. Arthur's my hero. He's dead.
Yeah. Just for your audience, know who Arthur was, because I know some of the young people don't know.
Arthur Schlesinger was the top historian in the John Kennedy's administration.
Right.
And Stephen is his son, who's brilliant, and the interview is just wonderful because people like Eleanor Roosevelt was around. He was at the elbow of these people when they were talking to his father. So he grew up with all these people around him. Fascinating interview about the UN and the whole world.
Well, yeah, in fact, Stephen talked about that. He said as a teenage boy, he thought everybody had, people like Eleanor Roosevelt visiting their kitchen. And I said, really? We're in sabbatical right now. We're taking 8 weeks off and building a new studio and getting ready for the fall.
Great.
That's excellent.
We will follow you.
Yes, absolutely.
So Ken, listen, I think we have another show pushing up behind us here, so we have to get off. So I'm getting this. So listen, I want to thank you both. It was great to have you on, and I think this is our first episode, and I hope we can keep the bar high, and you two very much put it up there. So I appreciate it.
Making us look good.
You're making us look good.
Thank you for making us look good.
Let's do the program on cynicism.
Yeah.
Yes. I might be able to lead that one. So.
And I want to thank the viewers for staying with us, and we will let you know what our new episode will be soon. And so be safe, be well, and be smart. Take care.